This railroad, it's a Maine icon. The ghost trains of the Allagash, the abandoned locomotives. You see pictures all over the place. You see all this stuff. When I first got interested in the railroad, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and we took a trip to Churchill Lake. And at that time, there were still Lombards in the shed, and there was various different buildings that were still there. And at that time, my dad told me about these locomotives, but I didn't get a chance to go up and see them. And then later on, when I was in high school, we took a canoe trip, and I actually got to see the railroad and the locomotives, and it just totally blew me away. And I wanted to know, at that point, I wanted to know more. So I started trying to read as much as I could. Well then, when I got older, I started asking questions, and I was very fortunate to come into contact with some people who actually worked on the railroad. From nowhere to nowhere. How did I come up with that name? Ed Robichaud, one day, he was out plowing along the tramway. There was a lot of cleared land back then. And he had a workhorse, and he was out plowing. And it was kind of an overcast day, and he heard this airplane fly over. And he kept plowing. Then the airplane came down and actually come out of the overcast and circled around, and all of a sudden this note falls out of the airplane. The pilot dropped a note. So Ed walks over and picks it up, and it says, "Gotta land." So Ed wheeled the horse and the plow off to the side, and the plane come down and bumped down this biplane. And Ed ran over, and he's just, he's a kid. He's probably only seen less than a dozen airplanes in his life. And he runs over, and the pilot takes off his goggles. He says, where am I? He said, "I'm flying mail from Montreal to Boston." He says, "I got lost." He says, "I follow this railroad line." He says, "I follow it south and it ends." He says, "I follow it north and it ends." He says, "What's going on here?" And Ed looks at him in very broken English, says, he says, "This is the Eagle Lake and West Branch Railroad. They go nowhere to nowhere." So in 1902, two lumbermen, Fred Eyre, who owned Eastern Manufacturing Company, one of the largest mills in the eastern seaboard at the time, and Herb Marsh, who was a lumberman in Old Town, decided, hey, look, we want to harvest timber around Eagle Lake, and we need to get our timber south. They wanted to go into the Penobscot, not into the Allagash. So they come up with the idea of a steam-powered conveyor, what's known as the tramway. They built the steam-powered conveyor between Eagle Lake and Chamberlain Lake, a distance of about 3,000 feet across the isthmus. And here we are, this is a view looking north towards Eagle Lake. This is the headworks on Eagle Lake. And you can see the gate structure to raise and lower the rollers. And what they do is they feed the logs in from Eagle Lake, and then they load onto little dollies. They were running on 22-inch gauge track, and it would head across towards Chamberlain. They built this during the summer of 1902. And here's a view looking along the top of the tramway, and like I said, this is actually the top part, and it's supported on a trestle work. The returning trucks were actually running on regular ties sitting on the ground. If you go to tramway today, you'll see the remains of this, like a big iron skeleton stretched out for 3,000 feet. This is the boiler house that operated the tramway, and this is actually on the shore of Chamberlain Lake, and the gentleman standing there is O.A. Harkness. Now, the tramway operated from 1902 through the end of the 1908 season. At that time, they had harvested all the timber that was within easy reach of the lake. Fred Eyre came back, and this time he introduced Lombard log haulers. Now, Alvin Lombard, he invented the Lombard log hauler. He invented a workable Caterpillar track. His first Lombard, the first successful Lombard log hauler, operated on Thanksgiving Day, 1900. He was then granted a patent, and he went into production. He came up with the Lombard log hauler, made in Waterville, Maine, and steam-powered. And they were quickly accepted. And at that time, the main motivation force in the woods was horses. Lots and lots and lots of horses. In fact, in 1902, approximately 22,000 horses worked in the woods of New England. But anyways, they quickly superseded the horse, and they opened up vast territories for logging. What Fred Eyre did in the Eastern Manufacturing Company, they came back to Eagle Lake, and they went into Township 914, and they started what they call the Russell Brook operation. And this is a view of the Russell Brook Depot camp. The building directly behind the log hauler is the Lombard shed. Over to the left, you can see a pump And they actually had a steam-driven centrifugal pump, and they would pump water from the stream to supply water for the Lombard, and there's a woodrick over here on the right. This operation ran from 1908 through to the end of 1913. They operated 4 steam Lombards. And what they were able to do with this operation is they were able to go directly from Township 914. They were able to dump the logs directly on Chamberlain Lake. They didn't need the tramway. They didn't need it anymore. So here we are at the rollways up in Township 914. You can see the men loading the sleds. Lombard heading down the road. These are expensive machines. Look at the road. That road is groomed like you wouldn't believe. It was plowed, it was iced. Just like a railroad, they followed the lay of the land, trying to reduce and minimize the grades. The idea was to be able to haul a maximum load as efficiently as possible. Anything that they could do to ease the work, they would do. If they did have a downgrade, they would spread hay to help slow down the sleds. Sometimes they'd stop and they'd put chain binders around some of the sled runners to help slow them down. And just like with a railroad, the idea was you wanted to pull the sleds down the hill. And you can see here, it's quite a load that they have on. Here's the landings at Chamberlain Lake. Here's a nice little map. There's Umsaskus Lake, there's Churchill Lake, and there's Chamberlain Lake, and there's Tramway. And way over here is Lac Frontier. Now, how many of you ever heard of a railroad being thought of, conceived, and started within a couple of months? Okay. Just doesn't happen. So in early 1926, they started clearing the right-of-way. LaCroix had about 200 men out working. That winter, 26-27, was a very busy winter. Everything had to be moved in to build this railroad. And here we've got several oil tanks being hauled in by Lombard tractor. Lombards were the workhorse of LaCroix's empire. And by the way, just so you know, it was a 20-hour round trip by Lombard from Tramway to Lac Frontier. So oil tanks had to be delivered. Pulp cars, 45 pulp cars. And LaCroix picked these up. Most of these were labeled for Champlain Realty Companies. He bought them, moved them by rail to Lac Frontier, mounted them on, you can see here, they're on sleds, and moved them in the tramway. He also had to convert them so that they were automatic dump cars. Because LaCroix was a firm believer in automation. Everything, time was everything. Time was money. Master mechanic, Emal Labby, developed a side dump pulp car. And you can see here what they did was they put a slope floor over top of the stringers of the original flat car, and they made a hinged door, and right here you can see a plank that ran the length of the car. And what that did was when it was flipped up, it caught the bottom of the door and kept it from swinging open. And there's chains that run across through notches in the stringers over to a rod that runs a full length that's in pillow blocks, and you can ratchet this thing down and ratchet it tight. Then when you want to unload it, you just hit the dog and it would drop down and your door would open. So each one of these cars had to be converted. If you ever go to Tramway, take a look at the remains of the pulp cars and all the iron that's on those things. If you want to see brackets and bracketry and truss rods, I mean, it's unbelievable what's on those cars. Again, everything had to be brought in. In addition to basic supplies, rail, etc., he also had to move in 2 Plymouths, 2 18-ton Plymouths. And here's one sitting on the blocking at Tramway after a 50-mile trip through the woods. So in the spring of 1927, with everything in place, now remember, he also had to build houses, he had to build a boarding house, he had to set up a sawmill, all this stuff. So in the spring of 1927, they started grading and laying rail. LaCroix had a little Erie steam shovel. Here you have the 2 Plymouths working. One of the other tasks they had to do is build a trestle across Allagash Stream. 1,500 feet of trestle, and all they had was a little pile driver to put it in. In addition to moving everything in to build the railroad, he also moved a bridge and set it up at 9 Mile Bridge. If you've ever read Helen Hamlin's bridge, 9 Mile Bridge, that's the bridge she's talking about. LaCroix also had a whole fleet of trucks, Rio trucks, bought from Darlington and Bangor. And it's interesting when you read the correspondence that they went through tires like you wouldn't believe. And if you've ever seen these guys from Quebec drive up in the Allagash, you'll understand. It's amazing that all they didn't, that they didn't end up with just the steering wheel. I mean, they just thrashed those trucks. Those trucks were going 24/7. And this was actually taken at Churchill. That's the superintendent's house right there. Let's talk a little bit about motive power. There's an ugly beast. When I first started studying up on the railroad, I kept finding reference to a tractor converted to run on rails. But I never found any pictures, and I couldn't find anything but these oblique references to it. Back in the 1990s, when my dad and I were doing the historical inventory of artifacts and stuff at Tramway, we came across this set of wheels, locomotive wheels. And we couldn't figure out what they went to. They didn't go to the steam shovel, they didn't go to the locomotives or anything. Then one day, I was visiting with Avis Harkness Black. She's the daughter of O.A. Harkness. And I'm going through this photo album, and there is this picture. And immediately, I went through my photos at home, and I found pictures of those wheels that we documented. There it is. There's the tractor converted to run on rails right there. What they did was O.A. Harkness and the Greenville shops, they took a 10-ton Lombard and converted it to run on rails. That's actually the lags piled up on the back. The railroad used 3 Plymouths altogether. LaCroix actually owned 2, all labeled for the Madawaska Company. One worked at Tramway, the other one worked down at Umbazookas, and Great Northern had one as well that they ran on the 5-mile stretch. LaCroix purchased these brand new in February 1926, and he moved them in early 1927, as we saw. Now, one thing about moving supplies, all this equipment into Tramway, one thing you got to remember, you only had an average 90 days to haul this stuff in. That was it. If you didn't get this stuff hauled in, you were done for. Great Northern had a little bit easier. They trucked theirs from Greenville across the Golden Road and then barged it up Chisuncook. So let's talk about Eagle Lake and West Branch number 1. This locomotive was well used. And there's doubt whether it actually even ran on the Grass River. There's no photos of it in operation. There's no records of it in operation. We know they owned it. And we actually recovered a metal plate that was on the side of the cab all its life, ever since it left the Grass River. There was a metal plate on the side of the cab with the number 63 painted on it. And here it is at Tramway in 1927. When LaCroix started operations in August of 1927, his intent was to run that locomotive 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. And if you've ever been around steam locomotives, you know that that is totally, absolutely unrealistic. So they were having problems. Matter of fact, 63% of lost time due to locomotive malfunction was rung up that first year by number 1. But they did get it running, and they ran it that first season. And the first season was more of a trying to get the system down. What worked? You know, how many cars they could haul, what was the timing, how long would it take to make a trip? But they did get it working. But obviously, that locomotive was not going to suffice. So then they decided, they shopped around again. Now this time, he got a humdinger of a locomotive. Eagle Lake and West Branch number 2 was built in December 1901 for the Lakeshore Michigan Southern. It was number 780. It was built by Brooks Locomotive Works of Dunkirk, New York. And it was built as a mainline freight locomotive. By 1914, with the merger of Lakeshore and New York Central, it was renumbered 5780 and classified as a G43A. By January 1931, been sold to Ferguson and Allen in Batavia, New York. March of 1928, it was purchased by the Madawaska Company, LaCroix, and moved to Tramway. So he got a locomotive that he knew actually ran this time. And here's a picture of it, 5780, future Eagle Lake and West Branch number 2 out of Collinwood, Ohio in 1927. Here we go. Moving number 2 into Tramway. Again, the locomotive was delivered to Lac Frontier. They disassembled it. Here we have the boiler mounted on skids, on skis. Here we've got the frame and the drivers. In the back, we've got the tender. You can see here, they've got a timber running across the saddles, and they've chained up the drivers so they won't fall down through the boxes. And here it is hitched up behind the lumbar. It took about 3 days to move this into tramway. Lac Frontier, crossed 9 Mile Bridge. I believe they probably forded and went across the ice rather than going across the bridge. A stop in Clayton Lake and then on into tramway. Now you read again and again and again in articles about how these were moved down the lakes, Churchill Lake and Eagle Lake. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. First of all, the thoroughfare between Churchill and Eagle is usually open. The other thing is, why would he do that when he already had a network of log hauler roads that ran up the west side of Eagle all the way into Churchill. Part of it is what we call the 914 road. It was left over from the Eastern manufacturing operation. These locomotives, they were moved into Clayton Lake towards Churchill. They turned off from Churchill. Then they hit Russell Brook, the Russell Brook Depot Camp, and then they followed the 914 road right into Tramway. And if you hike into Tramway today, you're actually following part of that road. And here it is at Tramway, all assembled. Now imagine trying to assemble this locomotive. You don't have a crane. That little Erie isn't going to do it. Okay? It was all done with block and jacks. Look at this engine. It's immaculate. Absolutely immaculate. It's also not your typical logging locomotive. Here in New England, the typical logging locomotive was usually a Baldwin 242 or whatever, tank engine, or you'd have a Climax or maybe a Shea. LaCroix went for 63-inch drivers and speed. This locomotive tips the scales at 188,000 pounds. Now the locomotives were part of a vast network. He had cutting operations, you had to cut the pulpwood, you had to move the pulpwood, you had to get it to Tramway, you had to load it on the cars, you had to move it across the Bazookas, dump it. It was a huge network. At one time, it's estimated that LaCroix had close to 3,000 people working in the woods. One of his big base camps, depot camps, was at Churchill Lake. And here you can see the Lombard roads coming in. It wasn't unusual for Lombards to haul pulpwood a distance of 20 miles or more from the Musquecook Lake region. Lombard tractors would go out. LaCroix had a fleet of close to 30 tractors. And these would go out Musquecook Lakes. They would do nothing but haul. Each one of these tractors would go through about 8 gallons of fuel an hour. Here you can see the tractor, the sleds, and look at that mound. That's being piled up on Churchill Lake. Now these tractors, they'd run night and day. Once they started, they wouldn't stop. They had an average of 90 days to move this pulpwood. One season, he had contracted for 200,000 cords of pulpwood. In addition to that, he was also taking timber, standing timber that he could use. He had an agreement with Great Northern where timber that was under a certain size would go as pulpwood. Timber over a certain size would go to his mill in Keegan. So he was working the Allagash both ways. But these tractors would run 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Usually at night, a driver would get in and start hauling supplies to the various camps. Now, the drivers were pretty interesting. They had one driver, a couple of drivers, the Fecto brothers. And the Fecto brothers came on and they were driving. Well, this one scaler working at the landing was going nuts. He's like, how's this guy making a 6-hour trip in 3 hours? And then the other thing is that the boarding house, they knew that Mr. Fecto was driving all night long, and yet at 5 o'clock in the morning, he come bouncing down the stairs and ready for work, looking just as chipper as could be. It took them a little while to realize that they were identical twins. And then, so they added a lot of spice, but then eventually the RCMPs came over and took them away in cuffs because apparently they had robbed the bank. So anyways, here you've got the boarding house at Churchill, and you've got the horse barn. The first time I went to Churchill, the horse barn was still there. It was all whitewashed on the inside, had electric lights. It was amazing. Today, just the boarding house and the warehouse remain. Blacksmith shop. There's also a school at Churchill, state-run school. But the parents felt that, you know what? We need something extra for our kids. So they set up a Catholic school over the blacksmith shop. And if you've ever read Helen Hamlin, this is the school she taught in right here. Now let's move on to Eagle Lake. They piled the logs up on Churchill during the winter. Come the spring thaw, they start booming it up the lake to Tramway. And Tramway wasn't quite as big as Churchill. You had the boarding house. You had various cabins. That's actually the forestry camp right there. You had a sawmill. You had oil storage tanks. There's enough oil storage for over 250,000 gallons of oil. Now remember, locomotives were burning 40 gallons an hour. Here's the engine shed. You can see the remains of the old tramway. And you've got the 3 loading conveyors. These were powered by big single-cylinder Fairbanks Morris diesels. 2 of those engines are actually sitting in the woods up at Churchill today. So here's the loading tracks. Here's the Y to turn the locomotive. Up here further, up through the cut, this is the big cut. This cut was a little over 1,000 feet long and about 20 to 25 feet deep. And to the north, just at the northern end, or the western end of the cut, you'll find a 3-way stub switch on the main line. And on one side, there's about 15 pulp cars sitting there rotting. On the other side, there's 5 more pulp cars. And then you've got the, if you follow the roadbed back, you'll see the gravel pit where they actually excavated. We didn't even know that existed. When we were up there working in the 90s on the locomotives, we had an old elderly gentleman with us, and one day he disappeared. And everybody became rather concerned, so we started looking for him. And some of our guys ran up through the cut, because we've been brushing out the cut, and they went running up through the cut. Well, they came across these pulp cars. The state of Maine didn't even know they existed. So that was pretty cool. And we found Hap. He was just asleep. Now, once the pulpwood was up at Tramway, they'd lock it in with the booms. And if you look right here, that's a horse on a raft. They had a capstan. And the horse would power it. And he'd just walk around. And his job was to tighten up the booms to crowd the pulpwood into the end of the conveyors. Okay? This is actually towards the end of the operation. You can see massive amounts of driftwood. This is a view of Tramway early on. You can see the oil tanks. That's the pump where they would fuel up. Engine shed is way back there. Pulp cars over here. You can see how clear it is. This is the boarding house at Tramway. Again, LaCroix believed in providing for his men. So he built this big boarding house, today just a stone foundation. It was about 125 feet long. Now here's a view of the loading conveyors. They could load 2 strings of cars at once. Okay? Here's a little Plymouth. Here's Eagle Lake. These conveyors were over 225 feet long. Here's another view. Again, you can see the conveyors. This is looking up the one of the loading conveyors. And what's interesting with this picture, again, you can see the pulp cars. You can see the engine shed. You can see locomotive number 1. This was the 3rd conveyor. This was taken right at the end of operations in 1933. This conveyor has already been removed. Here's another view looking at the oil tanks. There's your track, there's your boarding house. There's an ice house over here. Again, oil was the lifeblood. It all had to come in from Lac Frontier. And LaCroix would order oil. Like, I believe one time he placed an order for 1 million gallons. And this is how they moved it. Lombard tractor and in these sleds. This photo was taken later on in 1955. You can see the water tank. The oil tank is gone. There's the shed for the Lombard. And these timbers supported the storage tanks. This is the locomotive shed that was there, just very simple, tar paper siding. So in September 1933, the locomotives were parked in the shed, and they were basically abandoned. And he sold his holdings to J.D. Irving. And then in 1969, Irving sold the parcel of land at Tramway to the state of Maine. So anyways, in a not too how could I word it kindly? In a moment of not really thinking, they decided that they should eliminate the old buildings at Tramway. They did this a lot at abandoned lumber camps because they didn't want squatters. They also didn't want the fire hazard. So they sent a couple of gentlemen in, they flew them in, and they landed on the ice in the spring of 1969, and their task was to burn the buildings. So they burned the old Forest Service camp, they burned a lot of the other buildings that were remaining, and they went over to the engine shed, and they said, are we supposed to burn this? So they went back to the plane, they radioed in, and they said, yes, we said everything. And they said, well, are you sure? And they kept asking them, and finally they said, look, if you want to keep your job, you're going to do this. So they torched it. And the locomotives had been covered in cosmoline. All the mechanical parts, everything had been covered in cosmoline. There were still the curtains hanging in the gangway. These engines were complete. They had a lot of graffiti, but they were complete. And they went up. And I interviewed one of the men that did it. And it was like the saddest thing, because it was like interviewing a repentant murderer. I mean, he's never forgiven himself for it. But anyways, that's what it looked like when the deed was done. There was quite an uproar about it. The Forest Service went in and cleaned it up, and they painted the locomotives, and that was that. In 1996, the locomotives were in dire straits. As you can see, this is number 2, about ready to roll over. So as part of the Allagash Alliance group, we came up with the idea of jacking those locomotives up out of the mud and building a new roadbed underneath them, and then setting them back down. Sounds simple, until you realize that everything has to come in by boat. It was an all-volunteer effort. Originally, when I put in the original proposal, we had an estimate of close to $500,000 to hire a contractor to do this work. We ended up doing it for a little over $30,000. But this is number 1, up on the blocking. Once they were up on blocking, we had to excavate it's just clay underneath. So we had to excavate so we could put down a drainage system and put in a proper roadbed. It was all handwork. Everything was done by hand. Here we are lowering number 2 back down on the rail. You can see all the blocking. And we had surveyed, so we knew exactly, we set them right back down where they were. And when we set them down, we actually took copper pennies for that year and actually put them under each of the drivers. It's really cool. So 100 years from now, when somebody has to go in and do it again, they'll jack them up and what are these pennies? I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I hope you've learned more about the Eagle Lake and West Branch Railroad. You know, I hope that you get up there someday and explore. The idea is that you have to hike or canoe in, and it makes the experience twice what it would be. When you wander around, you're going to discover things. And it doesn't matter if 100 people have discovered the idea, you've discovered it. I urge you to try to get up there, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Thanks.